On July the 24th, 1990, Pantera released their 5th studio album, Cowboys from Hell. An album that is widely regarded as one of the most influential metal records of the early 90s. It's considered to be the band's breakthrough album, and it signified a dramatic transition in their career. They had gone from an all-out Van Halen-loving hair metal 4-piece to an innovative groove metal thrash band. Cowboys from Hell would be their first major label release and would see them touring with Judas Priest, as well as playing the iconic Monsters of Rock festival to a crowd of over 500,000 people. The early 90s Pantera sound truly was something remarkable, but it had some stiff competition to contend with. Megadeth were riding high with Rust in Peace, Judas Priest had unleashed Painkiller, and Alice in Chains were pioneering the new Seattle sound movement known as grunge with their debut LP, Facelift. Pantera, though, had something very unique about them in the form of two passionate musical-loving brothers, Vincent Paul Abbott and Darrell Lance Abbott. Both born in Texas in the 1960s, the pair would be born into a world of music. And although the real Pantera journey began in 1990 with the release of Cowboys from Hell, their journey to becoming Pantera started long before they were even born with their father, Jerry Abbott. Jerry was an American music country singer, sound engineer, and record producer. This is the man that would not only encourage his two young sons, Vinnie and Darrell, to become musicians, he would also produce Pantera's first 4 albums. He was also becoming a teenager in the mid-50s when Elvis Presley was about to change music forever with the birth of rock and roll. It seemed that fate had only one thing in store for the Abbott brothers, and they would be at the forefront of heavy metal for decades to come. Along with the classic lineup that included Rex Brown and Phil Anselmo, they would influence metal music in a way that will never be witnessed again. A one-of-a-kind band with a one-of-a-kind sound. This is Cowboys from Hell, the story of Pantera. Jerry Abbott was born at 1:40 a.m. in the Hendrick Memorial Hospital in Abilene, Texas on the 8th of April, 1942. By his own account, he had a very easygoing and supportive upbringing by his parents Lonnie and Ruby Abbott. Ruby was a loving housewife, and Lonnie was an auto repair mechanic with his own garage, Abbott Auto Electric. He also played guitar and sang. Lonnie was a regular for local music and entertainment festivals where later in life, Jerry and his brother would sell popcorn, exposing them to an early form of the music entertainment business. By the time Jerry was in elementary school in 1954, he was asked to try out for the football team, but being a small kid, he was subsequently crushed at tryouts and quickly realized this probably wasn't the path he was supposed to follow. Just as he was heading to junior high in 1955, Elvis Presley was about to unleash rock and roll onto the world. Jerry would often refer to a famous John Lennon quote to describe his early teen years before the birth of rock and roll, which was, "Before Elvis, there was nothing."
I'd like to tell you that we're going to do a sad song for you.
That's how Jerry felt. He was just a normal kid taking piano lessons and playing baseball. But Elvis, Johnny Cash, and Jerry Lee Lewis were about to change that. One day when Jerry was in the car with his father Lonnie, he heard Elvis come on the radio and his mind was blown. He decided there and then he wanted to become a musician. He wanted to become a rock and roll lead guitar player. Despite lead guitar not really being a profession you would follow, it wasn't even really a profession back then. Shortly after this, Jerry would buy his first guitar from Sears and Roebuck for $39. Jerry Abbott would spend the next 4 years teaching himself the guitar, without any formal lessons. All he had was his new instrument and Elvis records. He learned the guitar player for Elvis was called Scotty Moore, and tried to replicate every string bend and chord pattern he could hear or figure out. Jerry had been bitten by the rock and roll bug, and it wasn't letting go. Shortly after discovering Elvis, Jerry would be introduced to the music of Conway Twitty sometime in 1958, and this had an even bigger impact on his newfound love for music. It wouldn't be long before Jerry had found a band to join and was playing live gigs that actually paid. After landing a steady gig with a band called Tooter Boatman and the Chaparrals, he was well on his way to living his dream life. However, at the age of 22, something far more important was about to happen to Jerry, and that would be the birth of his first son, Vinnie Paul Abbott. Vinnie and Darrell were born just 2 years apart. Vinnie Paul was born on the 11th of March, 1964, and Darrell came into the world on the 20th of August, 1966, both of whom would develop incredibly active childhoods, encouraged by their father Jerry. Vinnie started to play the drums at just 2 years old, for no specific reason, he just seemed to like them, whilst Darrell would help his old man string up his guitar. You can see how the Abbott brothers were naturally going to follow the path of becoming musicians. It was in their blood. Their father Jerry was by now an accomplished songwriter and soon-to-be producer, and his father before him was also in a relatively successful band. Although Jerry didn't specifically tell his kids to follow a career in music, it was obvious they were heading that way. By 1978, Vinnie was attending Texas Jam, a nearby music festival that ran up until 1988. He'd gotten to watch bands like Aerosmith, Journey, Heart, and more importantly, Van Halen, when he was 14 years of age. And by the time Darrell was just 12 years old, he'd fallen in love with Dean guitars. As the story goes, Vinnie brought home a tuba one day and his father said there's no way you're going to make any money with that, and so he bought Vinnie his first drum kit. And it wouldn't be long before Darrell got his hands on his first guitar. At the age of 14, he entered a local talent contest that took place at the Agora Ballroom in Lake Highlands. The contest was to find the best guitar player in the area. Darrell would enter and he would smoke the competition despite being the youngest kid there, winning his very first guitar, which just so happened to be a Dean guitar, the very same that would become his signature instrument. One of the judges also happened to be Dean Zielinski, the founder of the guitar brand. Darrell didn't stop there though. He also won a Charvel and an ESP in subsequent contests, and then he was banned from further contests as he kept winning. It's no surprise Darrell and his brother Vinnie were becoming accomplished musicians at such an early age. They were both still teenagers, yet the music-rich environment their father Jerry had provided for them was more than enough to nurture their early talents.
They were real supportive. They always told us no matter what you do, just be the best at it if you do it, and it really made us practice a lot. Our dad was a musician, so gave us a really good, springboard to go from. And, we just always wanted to play music, man. We grew up like best friends, there was never any competition because we had a common love, and it was music,
The boys would grow up with a diverse taste in music. You had their father Jerry, who was traditionally coming from a Texas country music background with some hints of rock and roll, and much like every other teenager in the 70s, Vinnie and Darrell were discovering Black Sabbath, Judas Priest, Van Halen, and Kiss.
I think we better call out Dr. Love!
Van Halen and Kiss would play a huge part in Darrell's early life. He became obsessed with Kiss's lead guitarist, Ace Frehley. So much so, he would dress up like Ace and play along to Kiss records in his bedroom. And the Van Halen influence was clear during his competition winning days, as he'd blast out Eruption during his time on stage to help him win all of those guitars. It should come as no shock to the average rock and roll fan that Alive by Kiss, the first live album released by the band in 1975, would become a favourite in Darrell's early record collection. This record and Ace Frehley's guitar playing alone is responsible for influencing more guitar players during the last 5 decades than almost any other album. With Darrell and Vinnie's musical ambitions beginning to grow, it wouldn't be long before the pair decided to form their own group, and that band would become Pantera.
Well, I'll tell you what the bottom line behind that is.
It could have been demo tapes, you know, and they got lost in the wash and shit, you know?
The bottom line is we could all be immediately richer, once again, if we wanted to bounce on the success of these other albums that we've made and try to take those old records and put them out and, you know, commercialize them and make people think that they're the same kind of music that we are today, you know? So it's just something that we feel like those albums were good. They're part of our history, but they're also a collector's item, man.
Yeah, growing process.
Still in their teenage years, in 1981, Darrell and Vinnie would start jamming together, with Vinnie on drums and Darrell on guitar. Vinnie had been pestering Darrell to learn some songs they could play together, and the first jam session they had lasted around 12 hours, and all they did was run through Deep Purple's Smoke on the Water. This was essentially the birth of Pantera. By this time, both of them had made a name for themselves in school and around the local area as people got to know them as up-and-coming musicians. 3 kids from the local high school would approach Vinnie to ask if he wanted to drum for their band: Terry Glaze, Tommy Bradford, and Donnie Hart. Vinnie said he'd join, but on one condition: that his little brother Darrell also got to join the band with him. There was no chance Vinnie was going to leave his brother behind. They had already developed an unbreakable bond. It was all or nothing for Vinnie. Everyone agreed, and this became the first version of what would become Pantera. This early 5-piece, however, wouldn't last very long. Donnie Hart and Tommy Bradford quickly left, and Rex Brown was ushered in on bass, making the band a 4-piece.
And then one day in high school, when I was in the drum line, a guy suggested to me, man, you ought to call your band Pantera. And he goes, and I said, what the hell is Pantera? He goes, oh man, it's the coolest race car there is. Started investigating and found out it meant panther in Spanish, and really liked the way it just had a nice ring to it, and brought it to the band. I brought a logo in with a cat's head on it. It was the very first logo we ever had. Everybody loved it. And so we became Pantera from that point on. Man.
After a couple of name changes that included Gemini and Eternity, Vinnie Paul, Darrell Abbott, Terry Glaze, and Rex Brown settled on the name Pantera. By 1982, the band were playing local clubs as a covers act, blasting out Kiss, Van Halen, and every other hit rock song they heard on the radio at the time.
Yes, we were heavily influenced by bands like Judas Priest, Kiss, Van Halen, stuff like that in the early days, so we emulated our heroes.
And I used to walk by his room, because our rooms were side by side, and I'd see him standing in front of the mirror with his Ace Frehley costume on, just standing there holding the guitar, and I just walked by and go, man, is he ever going to learn how to play that thing? I didn't think he was ever getting on with it. One day he came in and said, you want to jam? And I kind of giggled, and I said, you can play that? And he goes, yeah, man, let's jam. So kicked in, and the first song we ever did was Smoke on the Water. We didn't play their version, and we didn't play the album version, but we played the 12-hour version.
All 4 members of this early incarnation of Pantera had a love for 70s rock and roll and the glam metal style that was emerging with the likes of Aerosmith and Van Halen. So this is pretty much what they based their image and sound on, which would lead to a version of Pantera that is completely unrecognizable from the influential groove metal band most of us came to know in the 90s. But nevertheless, this was still Pantera, and they were destined for big things.
Shit, we got a whole slew of things we might break out. We don't really know what we're gonna do until we start getting after it sometime. So yeah, man, we might have to throw that jewel up in there.
Whilst Pantera were performing mostly cover songs during their early days of playing the local club scene, they were also throwing in some of their own material during some shows, which would naturally lead to the band wanting to record an album of their own. Pantera's first record, Metal Magic, would be released on their own independent label on June the 10th, 1983. Metal Magic would be produced by their father Jerry, who was by now well known in the area and the country music scene. He had been working at Pantego Sound Studios from day one, although it started out as Blue Royal Sound sometime in the mid-70s. One of the first production credits Jerry earned on a recording at Pantego Sound Studios was for the Garrett Brothers Band in 1977.
Searching for my lost shaker of salt.
So he'd already had a good 5 to 6 solid years working as a producer by the time it came to recording his son's band. And with him naturally being Pantera's biggest supporter, it made sense for him to work on their first record. Pantego Sound Studios would play an important role in Pantera's first steps into the music industry. The band would record their first 4 albums here on their own independent label, giving them vital knowledge of how music production functioned, the experience of working in a semi-professional recording environment, and also giving them a taste of what it was like to follow in the footsteps of their heroes. The first 3 albums, however, would be far from the sound that made the band what they became. Metal Magic, released in 1983. Projects in the Jungle, released in 1984. And I Am the Night, released in 1985. All featured what you could call an early version of a Pantera lineup, which was Vinnie, Darrell, Rex, and Terry. All of these records were heavily influenced by Van Halen and the general glam metal sound that was blowing up in Los Angeles, but had obviously made its way across most of America, including Texas. And whilst these releases didn't exactly bring the band fame nor fortune, according to Vinnie Paul, they were shifting 10 to 20,000 copies of each record, which is pretty impressive for a glam metal band from Texas. Not only this, Pantera managed to land some decent support slots with the likes of Stryper, Dokken, and Quiet Riot. This era also gave birth to the first ever Pantera music video, a single taken from Projects in the Jungle called All Over Tonight in 1984. By all accounts, it was a decent music video for the time, and not a bad song for a glam metal band. Unfortunately, they were competing with the likes of Hot for Teacher and Jump by Van Halen, Lick It Up and Heaven's on Fire by Kiss, and Too Young to Fall in Love by Motley Crue. Artists that blew up in the 80s and were responsible for glam metal becoming a global phenomenon. So although Pantera experienced a small amount of success in the early days, they simply didn't stand out enough against the backdrop of hundreds of new glam metal bands appearing all over the country, trying to chase the same back-comb-haired dream. However, that was all about to drastically change with the introduction of Phil Anselmo.
How do you make it big in rock and roll or music? It's like, the most truthful answer would be take 15, 20 of your favorite bands and rip them off to all hell eventually. If you keep going with the same unit, meaning the same band members, and you grow together and grow together and grow together, that eventually you'll find your own sound. So I would say that was the case, and for me especially,
Philip Hansen Anselmo, born June 30th, 1968, in New Orleans, Louisiana. Some of his earliest childhood memories were of the French Quarter, an area of the city well known for its vibrant and historic music scene. He said he was surrounded by street musicians 24/7 and would also be exposed to artists such as the Beatles, Led Zeppelin, Janis Joplin, and Jimi Hendrix from an early age, thanks to his mother and her friends, some of whom were budding amateur musicians that mostly played guitar. By the age of just 9 years old, he had already managed to get his parents to buy him his own guitar and had already written his first song. Anselmo once said, "There was really no turning back from there. When I picked up the instrument, it wasn't like I begged someone to teach me this or that song. I didn't want to learn other people's music. I wanted to make my own.
I guess the popular stuff, I grew up at the house with, growing up with mom and her sister and dad on and off. I mean, it's such a wide variety of stuff. Rolling Stones, Led Zeppelin, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Queen, and then later, can't leave out Kiss either. I was a baby boy also at one time, but Kiss was a rock group. Peter Frampton, Ted Nugent, Old Scorpions, and later Van Halen, very innovative for guitar work, and this elaborate David Lee Roth character.
You can watch that interview in full with Phil Anselmo on John Edgington Documentaries. Phil Anselmo seemed to have his heart set on becoming a musician before he'd even hit puberty, much like Dime and Vinnie had. And by the time Phil was just 13, he had formed his own band with some local friends called Sam Hain, not to be confused with Glenn Danzig's band of the same name. On the surface, Anselmo's childhood appeared to be just as normal as the next kid. However, it would later be revealed that he was molested by both men and women when he was a child, although he's never gone into great detail about this. He once said, "Guess who was molested his entire childhood by numerous people, both men and women? Me. I've never told the world this, but I am now. Maybe because I'm almost 50 and I don't care anymore." If we just quickly look a little further into the Pantera story, Phil wrote a song called 25 Years in the early 90s, where he claims his father was a lying drunk who neglected his son and was also possibly one of his abusers. These paraphrased lyrics from the song speak volumes. Orphaned to the dope and drinks, but these years of detachment have left me with the demons now surfacing. Don't touch me, no, ever again.
It hurts, because they don't know you. They don't really know you. They don't know the struggles. They don't know what it's like. Most writers and media people are wannabe musicians anyway that can't do it. That's the truth.
As we all know, Pantera became well known for their aggressive music, and Phil became a very unique metal singer, as you can hear from the pure rage in his voice, which most likely came from a place of anger and torment. The torment from his childhood that he clearly struggled to deal with. By the age of 17, Anselmo had already been playing in local clubs and decided to quit Grace King High School in Louisiana to join a band called Rapid Phase, later renamed to Razor White, in line with a song Phil had written. Razor White was mostly a covers band playing Judas Priest, Black Sabbath, and Iron Maiden, riding the local club circuits. Anselmo, though, was quickly becoming bored with this band and their lack of willingness to explore other genres and styles. And after just over a year with Razor White, it wouldn't be long before Anselmo would discover Pantera.
I know Pantera invented a whole different style of heavy metal. We took our influences and whatnot, but hey man, what's it take to be big? Musicians, What do I gotta do? What do I gotta do? There's a difference between a decade ago and today. A decade ago, bands used to take their favorite 10 bands and rip them off to all hell. Rip them off. But within those 10 bands, you're gonna find your own style.
Terry Glaze had decided to part ways with the Abbott brothers due to personal conflict, which led to numerous singers trying out for Pantera. Over the coming months, they would struggle to find a singer that had the right voice along with the right image, until sometime during 1986, when Phil Anselmo heard about the opening for a new frontman. Anselmo called Vinnie and arranged an audition, but it didn't exactly work out how they expected. According to Jerry, it was a completely different kind of voice the band had previously considered. They were used to dealing with David Lee Roth and Robert Plant style vocals, when in walks Phil with his mixture of guttural growling and screaming high notes reminiscent of Rob Halford. This wasn't exactly the singer they were looking for, but they still felt a connection that they couldn't ignore. Rex Brown would later reveal how that first audition essentially consisted of them ripping through every Judas Priest song they knew how to jam, chugging down bottles of tequila, and blazing through joints.
just the chemistry between us. I can remember when Dime didn't hardly even know a bar chord. He went into his bedroom for about a year and came out this prodigy. He was so gifted of how he would pull off of a string before he picked it. This kind of this weird feel, and that's what made it unique. We had that stop and that boogie, but we just played it extremely fast.
When Phil entered the picture, Pantera had written most of their fourth album, Power Metal, which saw the band leaning towards a heavier style of playing, though it would take 2 years for the new lineup to complete this record, as they decided to give Phil the opportunity to show the band what he could really do. Power Metal wouldn't be released until 1988. During this time, they would continue to play local shows and tour as much as possible. And this is where Phil really started to push the boys in Pantera to listen to more music from Metallica, Venom, and of course Slayer. Rex Brown would later explain how the Abbott brothers were somewhat closed-minded to this style of music, thrash metal, but Phil would always be in control of what they listened to, driving from gig to gig. Phil seemed to be impressed with the new direction Pantera were moving in when it came to the riffs on the new record. So he saw an opportunity to integrate his metal and hardcore influence into the mix. When Power Metal was released in 1988, there was no denying the band had dropped the dream of becoming the next Van Halen and started to focus on a heavier, more dynamic metal sound. It was definitely more Judas Priest than it was glam. This is also around the time they decided to drop the spandex and the hairspray, with Vinnie once saying, "These clothes don't play the music, we do." It's widely accepted that Phil Anselmo was the main reason for Pantera changing their sound, but there was one man who you could argue had a much bigger impact, and that man was none other than Kerry King from thrash icons Slayer.
I'd like to introduce you guys the coolest band in the planet, Pantera!
By the summer of 1988, Slayer had released their fourth record, South of Heaven, a follow-up to the hugely successful third album, Rain in Blood, from 1986, that featured the now iconic song Rain in Blood. Thrash was unavoidable by this point in the 80s, with Anthrax, Metallica, and Megadeth also spearheading this heavy metal revolution, and Phil Anselmo was a big fan. Later that year, Slayer were embarking on their World Sacrifice tour in support of South of Heaven, and just so happened to be playing one night close to a Pantera show. A local radio DJ called Phil Anselmo and introduced him to Tom Araya, Slayer's frontman. That same night, Slayer went to check out Pantera live, and Phil instantly connected with Kerry King. They swapped numbers and would soon be talking on a regular basis. Kerry King would spend the next few months visiting Pantera in Texas and started jamming with the band. They even played some shows together. This also led to Kerry sitting down with Dimebag Darrell on a more personal level, where he would teach Dimebag the power and potential of thrash. Phil Anselmo later stated in an interview that these sessions between Dime and Kerry King would be the real catalyst for the change in Pantera's sound. It seems to be no coincidence that when Pantera started to write and record their fifth studio album throughout 1989 and early into 1990, that it would be a far cry from their previous glam, polished hair metal offerings after nearly a year of being influenced by Kerry King and the music of Slayer.
We're learning South of Heaven for tomorrow.
We already know that Dimebag Darrell was a fan of thrash, but it seemed as though he just wasn't too keen on integrating it with the music of Pantera until Phil and Kerry came along. Pantera, though, were already on a path to becoming something special, and Dimebag himself was even headhunted by Dave Mustaine to join Megadeth during this time period. Darrell, however, refused, as Mustaine had already hired a new drummer, and he wouldn't leave his brother Vinnie behind. The next big step for the Abbott brothers, Phil and Rex, would be a record deal. 1989 would see the band face 28 separate rejections from major record labels until Mark Ross from Atco Records saw the band live for the very first time in September of the same year. After just one song, he called his boss and demanded that Atco Records sign Pantera. This signing would mark the end of an important chapter in Pantera's career, ushering in a new era that would give birth to one of the greatest metal albums to have ever graced a turntable, Cowboys from Hell. Cowboys from Hell, released on July the 24th, 1990, introduced the world to a new style of music. It would later be named groove metal. Aggressive, powerful, and certainly not for the faint-hearted. Whilst this record would see Pantera become global rock stars, it would also put the four bandmates on an incredibly destructive path. Just 1 year later, they would find themselves opening for Metallica and AC/DC at one of the largest ever rock and metal festivals to have ever taken place, Monsters of Rock in Russia, with an estimated audience of 500,000 people. It seemed as though this was the catalyst for fame and fortune for the Abbott brothers, Rex and Phil, and it quite rightly was, especially with the release of Vulgar Display of Power in 1992. Mouth for War and Walk became modern metal anthems for a huge proportion of America's youth. Pantera's touring schedule during the early 90s was chaotic at best. By the end of 92, they were supporting White Zombie before heading over to the UK to open for Megadeth, which would quickly be followed by a headline tour of the USA and again over in Great Britain. And whilst this is exactly what the band had been trying to achieve for so many years, it would also introduce a world of new problems that none of them had foreseen. Sometime in 1993, Phil had developed a serious back issue which would later be diagnosed as degenerative disc disease. The discs in his back had started to cause him severe pain as he spent most of his time on stage over the years, jumping from PA speakers into the crowd. Rex Brown said it got to a point where the band were tired of hearing him complain about the pain, so he eventually went to a specialist to have it treated. But when Phil was told it would take him over a year to recover, meaning he couldn't tour, he decided to go down the route of taking strong pain medication to manage his condition. By this stage in their career though, Vinnie was already heavily into ecstasy, Dime was drinking excessively, and Rex would also indulge in various narcotics. After all, they were living the rock star dream and partying hard like their idols had done before them. For Phil though, this would temporarily cost him his life. With his back left untreated, he was constantly having to increase the amount of pain medication he consumed, which eventually led to him abusing heroin. And on July the 13th, 1996, Phil Anselmo went into cardiac arrest after a show in Texas. Paramedics were able to revive him, but he was technically dead for 5 minutes. According to Vinnie and Rex, the band had no idea Phil was using heroin and were absolutely in shock. However, they had already noticed a year earlier that Phil was becoming distant from the rest of his bandmates, and tension started to build between them. Phil's onstage and offstage behavior had become erratic and unpredictable, putting the rest of Pantera on edge. And now, after his heroin overdose, Pantera's future was unstable to say the least. Pantera would continue to release records despite the now deep-rooted tensions between the band, with Far Beyond Driven released 2 years prior in '94, The Great Southern Trendkill in 1996, and Reinventing the Steel in March of 2000. Little did they know that Reinventing the Steel would be the last studio album the four of them would ever work on together. Along with being a vital member of Pantera during the 90s, Phil Anselmo also embarked on several side projects during the same time period, mainly Down, formed in 1991, and Superjoint Ritual, formed in 1993. Neither of these bands appeared to be incredibly active during this decade, so it didn't seem to be an issue for Phil or the boys in Pantera. In September of 2001, however, Phil said he wanted to take a break from touring and recording, saying he needed to recover, which was understandable after years of back problems and tensions within Pantera. The Abbott brothers were naturally surprised then when Phil not only hit the road with Down in 2002, playing over 40 shows, but also releasing a studio album with them in the same year called Down 2, A Bustle in Your Hedgerow, along with a debut album for Superjoint Ritual named Use Once and Destroy. The Abbott brothers essentially saw this as a big fuck you to Pantera, and rightly so. For any musician, it would be difficult to interpret this behaviour in any other way. Vinnie and Dime said they felt Phil had just abandoned Pantera, and they couldn't see any way forward, as Phil wouldn't even speak to them about what was going on. In November of 2003, speaking to a UK rock magazine, Dimebag Darrell said Pantera is officially over, and announced a new project called Damage Plan. Sadly, however, for Dimebag, this would be the last time he would share a stage with his brother Vinnie. On December the 8th, 2004, Damage Plan was scheduled to headline a show at the Al Rosa Villa nightclub in Columbus, Ohio. They were on tour to promote their debut record, Newfound Power, released earlier that year. It was a small, intimate venue with around 400 people in the crowd. One person, though, wasn't there to enjoy the show. At around 10:20 p.m., roughly 2 songs into Damage Plan's set, a man rushed the stage, shouting, "You broke up Pantera." He was carrying a handgun and opened fire on Dimebag Darrell at point-blank range. He was pronounced dead at the scene shortly after. 4 innocent people lost their lives that night, including Nathan Bray, a 23-year-old Pantera fan who jumped on stage and attempted to resuscitate Dimebag before taking a bullet to his chest. The person responsible for this carnage would be taken out by a police officer with a shotgun and carried away in a body bag. Before this tragic event, it was unclear whether Pantera would ever reform. Vinnie, though, could never forgive Phil for walking away from the band after Dime was killed. As far as Vinnie was concerned, there was no Pantera without his little brother Darrell. Vinnie refused to speak to Phil after Dime's life was taken, and as far as we know, Vinnie kept it that way right up until his death in 2018. Pantera had gone from 2 loving siblings jamming together in their teenage years to forming one of the most influential groups of a generation. The legacy of Pantera, along with the music the Abbott brothers blessed us with, will no doubt live on for many years to come. But there is no replacing Vinnie Paul Abbott or Darrell Lance Abbott, and may their heavy metal souls rest in peace.